Cade Whitaker stood in the rain and watched a stranger press a red seal across the steel door of his father's garage. That door had opened every morning for 22 years, first for Lawson, then for Cade, and on school-off days, for a little girl named Piper, who called the place her second home. Celeste Mercer sat behind armored glass in a $9 million Maybach, signed the seizure order without looking up, and said what powerful people always say when they want to feel clean about a dirty thing. A garage this small cannot stand in the way of a city's future. 3 days later, that same Maybach went silent in the middle of a $1 billion signing ceremony, and the only name on anyone's lips was Cade Whitaker. Stay until the end to find out why the most expensive armored car in Chicago could only be opened by the garage they had just sealed shut. The stretch of road along the western edge of Crestwick Boulevard had been changing for 3 years, and not in any way that favored people who worked with their hands. One by one, the old storefronts had sold, the chain-link fences had come down, and the pale blue signs of Mercer Dominion's development team had gone up in their place, announcing a logistics and executive transport hub that would, according to the press materials, redefine how private clients moved through the greater Chicago corridor. The language was polished and the renderings were expensive, but the core of the project was simple. Buy every parcel on the block, flatten what stood there, and build something that charged 15 times more for the same function. Most of the owners took the offer. Some held out for 2 rounds, got a higher number, and signed on a Tuesday. Only one parcel remained, a narrow lot with a brick building that had been Whitaker Motor Works since before the road had a proper curb. Cade Whitaker had inherited the garage from his father Lawson 8 years earlier, along with a rusted toolbox, a hand-drawn catalog of every engine he had ever opened, and a note taped inside the breaker panel that read, "This place will not make you rich, but it will keep you honest." He ran the shop the way Lawson had. Clean work, straight billing, no upselling on parts a car did not actually need. His clients were locals, delivery drivers, the occasional tow-in from the highway, and a small number of older collectors who knew that Cade had been raised on vehicles most modern shops refused to touch. He was 39, drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it, and had been a single father to Piper since she was 3. The garage was not a business to him. It was a structure that held his daughter's earliest memories of her grandfather, a place where the smell of machine oil and cold coffee meant safety, and a livelihood that asked nothing except that he be good at what he did. Mercer Dominion's first offer had arrived by certified mail and been politely declined. The second had come through a property broker who sat across from Cade at the workbench and explained, with a practiced smile, that the number on the table was considerably above market value. Cade had thanked him and asked if he needed help backing out of the driveway. The third approach had come in the form of Garrett Holloway, Mercer Dominion's chief operating officer and senior legal advisor, who arrived in a black sedan and spoke with the quiet certainty of a man who had never once been told no in a setting that actually mattered. He told Cade that the parcel was the final piece, that the whole project turned on this lot, and that the offer would not remain on the table indefinitely. Cade had looked at the man, looked at the sedan, and said the table could wait as long as it liked. Garrett had returned to Celeste Mercer with a different kind of report. He did not describe Cade as a grieving son protecting a legacy. He described him as a low-revenue operator using emotional leverage to extract a maximum payout, a man who understood that the project needed his land and was holding it hostage for a number far beyond what any reasonable appraisal would support. He added, almost as a footnote, that the garage had some outstanding issues, a tax notice that had gone unanswered, a business license that was technically in a renewal gap. He said he could resolve the situation through administrative channels faster than through continued negotiation. Celeste had heard the phrase administrative channels enough times to understand what it meant. She had asked whether the documentation was solid. Garrett had said it was airtight. She had moved on to the next item on the agenda. Celeste Mercer ran Mercer Dominion the way her father Warren had taught her, with clarity, speed, and an absolute intolerance for anything that looked like drift. She was 36, had taken the CEO role 3 years earlier after Warren's health had forced him back, and had grown the armored vehicle division into the most profitable segment of the business. In the meeting where Garrett's plan was laid out, she had looked at the site map, at the one small parcel that kept the project from closing, and made a decision based entirely on what was in the folder. She had not asked to speak with Cade, had not asked who he was beyond the property line, and had signed the paperwork because the paperwork said it was correct, and Celeste Mercer did not have time to read between lines that her own team had drawn. The crew arrived on a Wednesday morning, before the neighborhood had fully woken. There were 2 vehicles from Mercer Dominion's Facilities Division, a city compliance officer carrying a clipboard and a plastic badge holder, and Garrett Holloway standing near the rear bumper of his sedan, with his hands in his coat pockets and the look of a man who had done this kind of thing enough times that the discomfort had long since smoothed itself into routine. Cade was already inside when they knocked. He had been up since 5:30, working on a neighbor's pickup that had a brake line soft enough to be dangerous, and Piper was in the back reading before school. The knock was the kind that expected to be answered, and when Cade opened the door, Garrett held out an envelope without greeting. The documents inside cited a tax liability of $4,300 in outstanding municipal assessments, a business license flagged as expired 14 days prior, and an order of temporary administrative possession pending resolution of both. Cade read it twice, slowly. He had paid his taxes. He knew he had paid his taxes because he kept the receipts in a fireproof box under the workbench with every other document that mattered. The license was in a renewal window, not lapsed, and he had submitted the renewal form 6 weeks earlier with a processing delay notice from the city that he also had on file. He said all of this to Garrett, quietly and precisely, the way a man talks when he knows he is right but also knows that being right is not always the same as having power. Garrett replied that these were matters for the administrative process to resolve, that the temporary possession order had been properly filed and properly executed, and that if Cade had documentation to support his position, he was welcome to present it during the adjudication period. Piper appeared in the door to the back room, backpack already on, lunchbox in hand, ready for a morning that was about to become something she would remember for a long time. She looked at the strangers, at the papers in her father's hand, and then at the door of the garage where one of the facilities men was already applying the orange seizure notice with a practiced peel and press motion. She asked, in the way that 8-year-olds ask things, directly and without the buffer adults build around hard questions, "Why are they putting stickers on our door?" Cade turned to her and said they were just doing some paperwork and that it would be sorted out, and his voice held all the steadiness he had left. He walked her to the sidewalk, waited with her until the school bus rounded the corner, and stood there until it pulled away so that she would see him standing, not bent. Celeste Mercer had arrived during the final stage of the sealing process, not to observe but because Garrett had suggested her presence would discourage any physical resistance from the occupant. She sat in the Maybach, engine running, and watched through the tinted, bullet-resistant glass as the garage door received its locks and the notices went up. The building looked smaller in person than it did on the site plan, older. She noticed the framed photo visible through the side window, a man in coveralls standing beside an engine block the size of a small refrigerator. And she noted it in the distracted way that people in her position note things that do not require action. When Cade walked back from the bus stop and stood in front of Garrett, She could hear none of what was said, but she could read the geometry of the conversation. A man who had been outpapered standing in front of a man who held the papers. She lowered the window when Cade stepped toward the car. He did not shout. He looked at her and asked whether she had ever lost the only thing a parent left behind. The question was specific enough to land, and for a moment, Celeste's hand tightened slightly on the door panel. But Garrett's voice came in from the left, reminding her that sentiment at this stage would complicate the timeline, and Celeste had a board meeting in 2 hours and a continent of decisions waiting. She said, flatly, and without cruelty but without warmth either, that no organization could hold its commitments hostage to the grief of a single individual, however genuine. It was the kind of sentence that sounds principled until you are the individual in question. Cade absorbed it, looked at the sealed door of his garage, and then looked back at her with an expression that was not anger and not pleading but something quieter and more durable than either. He said, "One day you will need something that is behind that door." The window went up. The Maybach pulled out into the rain. The signing ceremony had been 3 years in the making. The contract Mercer Dominion was set to execute that Thursday afternoon was a partnership agreement with a consortium of international financial institutions needing armored transport, executive routing, and security vehicle maintenance across North American operations. A contract worth, across its full term, just under $900 million and positioned to make Celeste Mercer the unquestioned architect of the company's most important decade. The venue was the Hargrove Conference Center. 40 minutes before the scheduled signing, the delegate had arrived. The documents were in order, and Celeste's Maybach S680 Guard, a custom-configured armored sedan built to specification at a base cost of $9 million, was idling in the private entrance courtyard while Sterling Quinn waited for the signal to bring her inside. The Maybach S680 Guard was not a car that failed conventionally. Its engineering involved redundant systems at every level, dual batteries, isolated electronic modules, a multi-layer security architecture retrofitted with additional proprietary protocols when Celeste had taken the CEO role. The base car was already one of the most protected civilian vehicles on the market, but the Mercer version had been layered with a custom security framework, built years earlier by specialists who worked exclusively in the executive armored vehicle space, which made what happened next all the more disorienting for everyone present. Sterling reached for the door handle from the outside and found it unresponsive. He tried the key fob. Nothing. He moved to the secondary panel on the B-pillar, entered the override sequence. Nothing. The dashboard visible through the glass showed a screen that had turned a steady amber, displaying a line of text in a small, unhurried font. Legacy lock Protol. Active. The engine was still running. The climate system was still running. Celeste was inside, uninjured, unbothered by any physical threat, but completely and inexplicably unable to open any door, unlock any latch, or receive a valid override command from the outside. She pressed the interior release. Nothing. She tried the manual mechanical backup. It moved but engaged nothing. The car had, in every practical sense, decided that it was staying shut. Sterling called the technical team. The technical team called the systems engineer. The systems engineer connected a diagnostic tablet to the external port, ran 3 passes, and came back with a look that Sterling had learned to read over a decade of working around vehicles most people had never seen up close. The look of a specialist who has just found a problem outside the boundary of their specialty. The error code that kept surfacing, Legacy Lock Protol, was not in any of the current Mercer Dominion technical documentation. It was not in the manufacturer's service manual for the S680 Guard. It was not in the aftermarket security retrofit documentation that had been filed with the vehicle when the custom system was installed. It was an old designation, older than the retrofit, older than Celeste's tenure. and nobody in the courtyard could explain what it meant or how to clear it. Garrett appeared from the side entrance and surveyed the situation with the composure of a man who had expected this to happen, but had not expected to be standing quite so close to it. He told the technical team to keep working, told the conference center liaison there would be a brief delay, and privately telephoned Von Mercer to report that the signing might be in jeopardy. Von's response was measured, as it always was, and it contained a suggestion that if Celeste could not manage to arrive at her own signing ceremony, the board would need to give serious consideration to whether the confidence placed in her leadership was still warranted. It was the kind of remark that sounds like concern and functions as a threat. Sterling heard none of that call, but he had been around these people long enough to read the situation. He walked back to the Maybach, put his hand on the warm hood, and thought about the phrase on the screen. Legacy lock. He had heard that term once before from a driver who had worked the early years of the Armored Division and had mentioned offhandedly a mechanic named Lawson who had designed some of the original security layers for the family fleet. Lawson had a son, the driver had said. Kid grew up in the shop, named Cade. Sterling walked back to the diagnostic screen, looked at the code one more time, and spoke quietly into the small radio clipped to his shoulder. He needed to reach Ms. Mercer through the intercom. He needed to tell her something she was not going to want to hear. Cade was at the kitchen table of a rented room 12 blocks from Whitaker Motor Works when the first call came through. He did not answer it because the number was Mercer Dominion's general office line, and he had nothing to say to that number. He was sorting through the tools he had brought out before the seizure, laying them on the table in the order he would need them if he ever got back inside, and Piper was at the counter, doing homework in the focused silence she had, when she was trying not to ask questions about what she had seen that morning. The second call came from a number he did not recognize. The third came from Sterling Quinn's personal cell, a number Cade had because Sterling had once brought a vintage town car to the shop under his own name, off the company books. Cade answered. Sterling's voice was professional and unhurried as he explained the situation. The Maybach was locked, active legacy lock. The code was showing on the dash, and nobody had any idea what it meant or how to clear it. The signing was in under 40 minutes, and the CEO of Mercer Dominion was sitting inside a car that believed its job was to not open. Then Sterling said what he had spent 3 minutes deciding how to say. The code is from your father's work. The framework, the only paper that explains how to get out of it, is in your shop. Cade did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the tools laid out in neat order. He said he knew exactly what Sterling was describing, and he also knew that the documentation was currently behind a sealed door that Celeste Mercer had signed the order to close. There was a pause, and then Celeste's voice came through. She had asked Sterling to hand the phone through the intercom to speaker relay so she could speak directly. Her voice had its usual structure, direct, controlled, no edges softened unnecessarily. But underneath it, running like a current through the floor, was something that had not been there in the rain outside the garage 3 days before. She said she needed him to come to the Hargrove Center. Cade said he would be glad to help, but that his equipment and documentation were sealed inside a property she had taken from him. The silence that followed was the kind that occurs when a person built for forward motion finds themselves behind something they cannot move around. Celeste did not pretend the pause meant nothing. She said, I am aware of the situation. What would it take? Cade said, give me back my garage. Not a negotiating position, not an ask, a statement. In the courtyard, Garrett Holloway argued against it with genuine urgency. He said bringing Cade inside was a security risk, that a man with an active grievance against the company should not be anywhere near the CEO's vehicle, that there was no way to verify his intentions. Sterling said the man's intentions were visible from the moment he had answered the phone. Cade had not said no, had not named a price, had not made demands. He had simply told the truth about what stood between the problem and its solution. Delaney Brooks had been standing nearby and had used the delay to pull the seizure order on her phone and read through it with new attention. 3 things bothered her. The tax notice had been sent to the property's old mailing address rather than the registered address on file with the city. The license renewal carried a pending status code that should have prevented an expiration flag, and the confirmation stamp from the city compliance office bore a date that was a weekend. She flagged all 3 to Celeste through the intercom and said it was possible the documentation justifying the seizure had not been as solid as represented. Celeste told her to keep looking. Then she told Sterling to make the call. Cade arrived in his truck, still wearing the same work shirt he had put on that morning. He had brought nothing except a single spare key and the knowledge that had been sitting in him since Sterling said the words "legacy lock" on the phone. A Mercer Facilities vehicle met him at the perimeter with a temporary access order signed by Delaney and drove him to the garage before bringing him to the conference center. He went inside alone, found the fireproof box under the bench exactly where he had left it, and lifted out the bottom tray, beneath the receipts and the renewal forms, where Lawson had kept the technical records no other mechanic had ever understood well enough to want. He took the folder, locked up behind himself, and said nothing to the facilities man waiting outside. On the drive to the Hargrove Center, he looked at the glass facade lit up in the late afternoon and thought about his father, who had built the thing inside that car and had never once been invited through those front doors. The courtyard was quiet in the way that places get quiet when a lot of people are pretending not to be watching something. The technical team was still clustered near the passenger side of the Maybach. Garrett Holloway stood near the entrance with his arms at his sides, and several conference center staff had drifted to the interior windows. Cade walked across the courtyard in his work shirt and grease-worn boots, and they all looked at him with the expression that surfaces when the situation has made clear that a man they would normally never have called is now the only useful person in the building. He did not look at Garrett. He stopped beside Sterling, looked at the amber screen through the windshield, and read the code once. Garrett moved forward and asked, in a tone designed to be dismissive without being overtly hostile, whether Cade had the relevant certifications to work on a vehicle at this security classification. Cade pulled the folder from under his arm, held it out, and said he had the original schematics of the man who designed the lock. He asked everyone to stop attempting resets. He said this quietly but with enough specificity that the technical team lead, who had been reaching for his tablet, stopped reaching. Cade explained that the legacy lock had a cumulative response to failed override attempts. Each incorrect reset pushed the system 1 layer deeper into its lockdown sequence, and the sequence had been built with exactly enough depth to outlast any competent modern troubleshooter who had never read the original documentation. He said, "If you have run more than 4 resets already, we have about 12 layers left before the car stops responding to anything short of a full disassembly." The technical lead said quietly that they had run 6. Cade nodded and said, "Then let us not run a 7th. Celeste heard all of this through the car's interior microphone system, which Sterling had left active. She had been inside for 41 minutes, uninjured, temperature regulated, phone working. But there was something in the specificity of what Cade was describing. The layers, the documentation, the knowledge sitting in a fireproof box under a bench in a garage she had ordered sealed. That was beginning to settle into her understanding like a weight that had not been there before. She had seen the folder he was carrying. She had heard the way the technical team stopped arguing the moment he told them something precise about their own equipment that they had not known. She thought about the weekend stamp on the compliance form, the speed with which Garrett had produced a complete documentation package for a process that should have taken weeks, and she made herself hold that thought rather than let it slide past. Cade asked Delaney to authorize retrieval of a specific document box from the garage, labeled in Lawson Whitaker's handwriting, stored in the secondary filing cabinet behind the hydraulic lift. 15 minutes later, the box arrived. Cade opened it on the hood of an adjacent vehicle and spread the pages out with the care of a man who had handled them before. Lawson's handwriting ran in clean columns across the technical drawings, interspersed with margin notes written in the slightly looser hand of someone's adding observations after the fact. One note, near the bottom of the page titled Legacy Lock, Failure Modes and Remediation, read, "If the protocol activates without a confirmed emergency command from the registered owner, examine the administrative signal path. The system should not be able to reach this state through ordinary wear or software drift. If it does, someone has taught the car to distrust the person it was built to protect." Cade read it aloud, not for effect, but because reading Lawson's words out loud was how he had always learned them. The courtyard was very quiet. He looked through the glass at Celeste and said, "Your car is not broken. Someone told it you were no longer who it was supposed to protect." The technical explanation that followed took time, but Cade gave it in the straightforward manner of a person interested only in accuracy. The legacy lock had been designed for a specific threat scenario, the possibility that an armored vehicle could be seized, physically or electronically, and used against its registered owner. The system was meant as a last resort, a mechanism that would render the vehicle inoperable to anyone who had not been authenticated at the deepest level of the ownership chain. It was built to activate rarely and only under genuine threat conditions. What it had never been designed for, Lawson's notes made clear, was the possibility that someone with legitimate administrative access to the vehicle's management system would deliberately push a command that mimicked the threat signature. The legacy lock had been taught to recognize a very specific kind of danger. It had no mechanism for recognizing that the danger might be wearing the uniform of an ally. Brielle Dawson, Mercer Dominion's data systems engineer for the Armored Vehicle Division, had arrived in the courtyard with a diagnostic workstation after being summoned by Sterling. She connected to the Maybach's external data port, brought up the event log, and displayed it on a portable screen. The log showed, at 11:47 the previous evening, an administrative authority update pushed to the vehicle's core management module from an internal Mercer Dominion operations account. The account was not Celeste's, not Sterling's, not the maintenance team's. It was a supervisory account at the layer between fleet management and executive operations, and it had pushed a single instruction: reclassify registered owner authentication status as provisional, pending board level. The legacy lock had received that reclassification and done exactly what it had been built to do. It had decided that the person inside was not confirmed as the person it had been designed to protect, so it had protected her from everyone, including herself. Garrett said that this was clearly a routine administrative sync, the kind of automated maintenance operation that ran across fleet vehicles regularly. Cade turned to the page in Lawson's notes that addressed update protocols and read aloud the relevant passage. The legacy lock was incompatible with any automated administrative updates run within 12 hours of a scheduled high-profile event. The system's designers had built in that restriction specifically because the authentication delay window created by any ownership reclassification would fall over the event period. Anyone who knew the system would know that pushing an admin update the night before a major signing would lock the car during the signing. This was not a design flaw, it was a design warning, and the warning assumed no one with legitimate access would ever deliberately use it. Brielle looked at her screen, and then looked at Garrett and did not say anything, which was itself a kind of statement. She had seen the timestamp. She had seen the account. She had been trying to find a benign explanation for 36 hours and had run out of benign explanations. Celeste began to understand the architecture of what had been arranged. If the car remained locked through the signing window, she would miss the ceremony. If she missed the ceremony due to what the official record would describe as a vehicle security incident, Vaughn held the authority under a specific emergency provisions clause to appoint a temporary signing representative for any executive function rendered unperformable by a documented security failure. In practical terms, Vaughn could sign in her place. And the version of the contract Vaughn would sign, Brielle confirmed after checking the document management system, included a final clause variation that transferred a significant equity share of the armored division to a private investment vehicle Vaughn controlled outside Mercer Dominion's corporate structure. The entire sequence, the seized garage, the locked car, the emergency clause, was a mechanism, not a chain of bad luck, a designed outcome. Cade used Lawson's manual restoration protocol to begin returning the vehicle to its baseline ownership state. He worked without rush, checking each module in the sequence Lawson had specified, verifying signal integrity before each step. He asked Brielle to confirm data values on her end as he went, asked Sterling to prepare for a door test at the final stage, and asked Celeste, through Sterling's relay, whether she remembered the confirmation phrase Warren Mercer had registered with the system when the legacy lock was first installed. There was a pause inside the car, and then Celeste's voice came through clearly. "Trust the hands that built the lock." It was a phrase her father had chosen because he had said, at the time, that he did not trust systems he could not understand, and the only systems worth trusting were the ones built by people who had skin in the outcome. The legacy lock heard the phrase, matched it to the original registration voice print, and delivered a single clean tone. The amber screen went dark. Sterling reached for the door handle. The door of the Maybach opened like any ordinary door, swung wide in the courtyard light, and Celeste Mercer stepped out onto the pavement for the first time in 53 minutes. She looked at Cade. He was already writing something in the margin of Lawson's notes, a restoration checkmark beside the last completed step. There were 17 minutes left before the international delegation's representative had indicated he would need to leave, and Celeste used 8 of them to make decisions that would have taken her previous self a full board session to reach. She stood in the courtyard with the signed seizure notice in her memory, and the document folder in Cade's hand, and the look on Brielle's face when the account log had shown who had pushed the update, and she made the choice that distinguished the people who ran things well from the people who ran them efficiently. She chose not to pretend she did not already know what she knew. She sent Delaney inside to file a legal notice of temporary suspension of the signing proceedings on grounds of documented internal interference with executive authority. Vaughn, receiving word of this in the lobby, called her phone. She sent it to voicemail. Garrett moved toward the exit. Sterling, who had anticipated this, was already standing near it. Inside the conference room, Garrett attempted to reframe the situation with the skill of someone who had spent decades making facts sound like perspectives. He told the delegation the vehicle incident had been a mechanical anomaly, now resolved. He suggested that Cade's presence was the action of a disgruntled third party with a personal grievance, and that the signing could proceed as written. The problem with Garrett's performance was that Brielle had already connected her workstation to the conference room's display screen. When Delaney asked her to show the event log timeline, the timestamps appeared on the wall in a font large enough for everyone to read without moving. The update had been pushed at 11:47 the previous evening. Garrett's access credentials were 2 rows above it in the same session log, placing him in the system 44 minutes before the update had been sent. He had not pushed it directly. but he had opened the door that someone had walked through to push it. Cade did not testify in the manner of a witness performing outrage. He spoke factually and in sequence. He said the administrative update had activated a security layer the vehicle's original designer had built specifically to protect registered owners from hostile takeover of their assets. He said the documentation to identify and reverse the activation had been stored in his garage. He said his garage had been sealed under a process that used falsified tax records and a manipulated license status to justify a seizure that would have been denied under any proper review. He said the timing of the seizure, 3 days before a signing ceremony where the vehicle would be present, was not a coincidence if you understood what documentation the garage contained. He did not say this to harm Garrett. He said it because it was the sequence as it had happened, and he had been taught by a man who believed that sequences, told accurately and completely, were the only honest language available to people without power. Celeste set the folder of Lawson's original documentation on the conference table. She said, "This is the technical record of the man who designed the system that protected my vehicle tonight, and whose work was stored in a garage this company seized 3 days ago using fraudulent paperwork." She said it without volume and without theater. She looked at the international delegation's representative and asked if he still had the 17 minutes he had mentioned. He said he had as long as was needed. Von Mercer had been a fixture of Mercer Dominion's board for 21 years, and in that time he had developed a talent for appearing steady by the simple method of never showing what he actually wanted until the moment when showing it was safe. He had watched Celeste build the armored division with the detached approval of an uncle who respected competence and the private vigilance of a board member who understood that the more valuable a division became, the more negotiable its leadership was. He had not disliked Celeste. He had simply reached a point where the returns on her continued tenure were lower than the returns available if the division were restructured under different authority. The plan with Garrett had been careful, had left no obvious fingerprints, until Brielle had preserved the session logs on a secondary drive that Garrett had not known about, because she had started keeping secondary copies the day she had been told, with a smile, that her concerns about the update schedule were not concerns she needed to pursue. The email that Brielle recovered and displayed took less than 30 seconds to read and less than 5 to understand. It was from Garrett to Vaughn, sent 11 days before the signing, and it contained one line that made the courtyard's ambient noise, when Brielle read it aloud, seemed to disappear entirely. Once the garage is sealed, no one left can open the guard in time. The room held that sentence for a moment, the way rooms hold things that cannot be unsaid. Vaughn looked at the screen. He did not look at Celeste. He did not look at Garrett. He looked at the middle distance of the kind that men look at when the architecture of something they built is coming apart, and they are calculating, with the only tool they have left, whether there is a version of this that does not end in the way it is ending. There was not. Celeste requested, formally and on record, the immediate suspension of Garrett Holloway from all operational roles pending an internal investigation into the administrative vehicle update, the seizure documentation process for Whitaker Motor Works, and the emergency authorization clause preparation that had been advanced in anticipation of her absence. She requested that Von Mercer's authority over the Armored Vehicle Division be suspended pending an independent audit of any transactions related to the private investment vehicle connected to the final clause variation. She made both requests in the room, in front of the delegation, because she understood that transparency in a damaged moment was the only currency still worth anything. The international representative said nothing immediately. He looked at the email on the screen. He looked at Cade's folder on the table. He looked at Celeste and asked a single question. Is the system, stripped of the interference that was documented here tonight, sound? Celeste looked at Cade. Cade looked at the folder and said, "The system is exactly as it was designed. It did precisely what it was built to do. The people who built it understood what they were building. The problem was not the technology. The problem was who was given keys to the room where the technology lived." The delegation agreed to continue. The signing proceeded under the original terms, 51 minutes late, with Garrett Holloway absent and Von Mercer sitting in a chair near the window, with the look of a man who has decided that stillness is still an option when all other options have been removed. Delaney filed the legal suspension notice with the Municipal Records Office before she left the building. Brielle's secondary drive was submitted to the company's Compliance Council as primary evidence. Sterling drove the Maybach out of the courtyard at 10 minutes past 9 in the evening, and as it passed the gate, the legacy lock indicator on the dash showed a single green light. Registered owner confirmed. The seizure order on Whitaker Motor Works was voided 11 days after the signing. The tax liability that had been cited was traced to a filing that used the property's old mailing address, an address that had been updated with the city 3 years prior, a discrepancy that Delaney confirmed had been exploited deliberately to ensure the notice never reached Cade. The license renewal had been manually flagged as expired in the city system by a contractor whose invoices traced back to a vendor account connected to Garrett's administrative network. Both findings were submitted to the city's Property Dispute Review Board, which set aside the seizure in full and ordered the restoration of operating status effective immediately. Cade received the paperwork on a Tuesday, read it at the kitchen table of the rented room, and set it down beside the toolbox he had been living out of for 11 days. Piper was across the table doing arithmetic. She looked up and asked if the sticker was coming off their door. Cade said it was already gone. She went back to her arithmetic. Celeste came to the garage on a Thursday morning with Delaney and without a convoy. The Maybach was not there. She arrived in an ordinary company sedan, parked on the street, and walked to the door of Whitaker Motor Works where the orange seizure notice had been replaced by the original sign. Hand-painted letters on a pine board, slightly faded, bearing the name Lawson had put on the building 30 years earlier. The lock was off. The lights were on inside. Cade was under a truck that belonged to a neighbor, and when he heard the door he came out and stood with a half-cleaned wrench in his hand and looked at Celeste Mercer standing in the entrance to the garage that had been her company's collateral damage and his entire life. She apologized. Not with the language organizations use when they want forgiveness without accountability, the passive constructions, the references to unfortunate outcomes, the suggestions that mistakes were made without an author. She apologized specifically. She had signed a document without meeting the person it affected. She had let a folder prepared by someone with a private motive stand in for her own judgment. She had looked at a small garage and processed it as an obstacle, rather than as a place where a person was building a life with what his father had left behind. She said she was sorry for all of it, and that sorry was the smallest thing she had available to offer. Cade listened. He did not tell her she was forgiven because forgiveness was not the point, and they both knew it. He said what he actually needed. His father's work acknowledged. Lawson Whitaker's name was in no official record at Mercer Dominion, despite the fact that the framework he had designed had just saved the company's most important contract and its CEO's position in the same evening. Celeste had already spoken with the company's historical records team. She committed, in writing and on the official record, to crediting Lawson Whitaker as the originating engineer of the legacy lock security framework in all Mercer Dominion documentation, past and present, relating to the armored vehicle division. She offered Whitaker Motor Works a formal contract as an independent legacy systems verification partner, meaning any vehicle in the Mercer fleet that ran components of the original Lawson architecture would be cleared through the shop. Cade said he would take the contract if it contained two provisions that were non-negotiable. The shop retained full operating independence with no obligation to the company outside the specific verification scope, and any engineer, driver, or technician who identified a system irregularity was protected in writing from any form of retaliation when they reported it. Celeste said both provisions would be in the contract by the following morning. They were. The investigation confirmed what the email had made apparent and the logs had made undeniable. Garrett Holloway had coordinated the falsification of the seizure documentation, had authorized the administrative authority update to the Maybach's management module, and had prepared the emergency signing authorization package for Vaughn in advance of the event, timed to activate if Celeste was absent for more than 30 minutes. He resigned before the formal dismissal proceedings concluded and faced civil litigation from both Mercer Dominion and from Cade on the property seizure, which Delaney litigated with the focus of a lawyer who had spent 11 days feeling personally responsible for a document she had processed without reading carefully enough. Vaughn retained his board seat because his direct authorization was difficult to prove beyond the email, which he characterized as a hypothetical planning exercise, but he lost all authority over the armored division and was required to dissolve the private investment vehicle that had been the ultimate destination of the equity stake. The independent auditors who reviewed his transactions over the previous 18 months found 3 additional instances of similar structuring and referred their findings to the relevant regulatory bodies. Celeste convened a full review of the process by which property seizures and acquisitions affecting private individuals were conducted. The new policy required an independent third-party assessment, a direct conversation with the affected party, a structured right of response, and a sign-off from legal counsel not connected to the acquisition team. Delaney helped design the framework and built a training protocol around it, so the policy would outlast any individual in the compliance role. Brielle Dawson was appointed head of a new data security transparency unit, whose function was to maintain independent copies of all vehicle system logs and report anomalous updates to a committee that included Sterling Quinn, who was given the authority to halt any Mercer vehicle for unscheduled review if he observed anything that did not match his standing expectations. These were not grand gestures. They were the ordinary, procedural work of a company choosing to be harder to corrupt than it had been before. Piper asked Cade, the evening the settlement papers arrived, whether they were still poor. Cade thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. He said they were not rich, that the truck still needed the manifold looked at, and the rented room would remain the rented room until the back payments on the garage mortgage were caught up. But the garage was open, the sign was back, and there was a folder in the filing cabinet with her grandfather's name on the cover and the words "Legacy Lock" in his handwriting, and that folder had done more in a single evening than most things people spent fortunes trying to build. Piper said she thought that was probably enough. Cade said, more than enough. Several months after the signing, the Maybach S680 Guard returned to Whitaker Motor Works. Not under emergency conditions. Under a scheduled maintenance order, authorized by Celeste's office, bearing the new contract designation at the top of the work order, Whitaker Motor Works, independent security systems partner. The car arrived driven by Sterling, who parked it in the same bay where Lawson had serviced its predecessors and where Cade had grown up handing tools to a man who understood that the most honest work you could do was the work no one else had the knowledge to do correctly. The shop still had the old toolboxes, the reference manuals stacked in the corner, the photograph of Lawson standing beside an engine block the size of a small refrigerator. Piper had added a drawing to the wall, taped beside the photograph, a big black car next to a small building with open doors and a sign she had spelled correctly on the third try. Celeste walked through the garage door, the way people walk through doors they did not expect to enter on equal terms, carefully, and with some awareness of what the space contained. She looked at the photograph and at the drawing and at the tools arranged on the bench in the same order Cade always kept them. She told Cade that the board had asked her to justify, in the last strategy session, why Mercer Dominion needed a formal relationship with a single independent shop, when the company had a full technical division. She said she had answered that the division was large enough to believe it already knew everything it needed to know, and that the shop was small enough to tell them when they were wrong, and that those were not overlapping functions. The board had not fully followed the reasoning, but had approved the contract renewal. Cade checked the Maybach's legacy lock module, ran the authentication sequence, listened to the door lock cycle through its test, and confirmed the system was clean. He wrote the result in Lawson's notation style in the margin of the verification log and handed Celeste her copy. She asked, quietly, whether he still carried what had happened with him. He did not pretend the question meant nothing. He said that the anger had been real and had not dissolved simply because the paperwork was corrected, but what remained was not anger. It was something more durable and more useful. The understanding that the larger something becomes, the more it tends to mistake size for rightness, and that the most important function a small place could serve was to be the place where that mistake got corrected. Celeste said nothing for a moment. She looked at the photograph of Lawson and at the open door of the garage and at the afternoon light coming through it onto the floor. Then, she said, "My father chose that phrase, trust the hands that built the lock, because he believed the only systems worth trusting were the ones where the builder had something real at stake." Cade said his father had believed the same thing. They stood in the garage that had been seized and returned and made into something more than it had been before, and outside, Sterling pulled the Maybach slowly forward in the drive, giving way to a local delivery truck that needed to get through. The heavy car moved without urgency. The small garage held its door open. On the wall, beside Lawson's photograph, the red seal was gone, and in its place was the hand-painted sign that had been there from the beginning. The one that said the name and nothing else, which had always been enough.
That's what I'm talking about, bro. It feels good. I'm fucking with this. And yesterday, Nick was like, "Bro, I love that game." I was like, "All right, maybe I should play it." So advanced to awaken talents. It's a great Soul. This is like one of the best Souls games. I think it's a good entry for people into Souls games because there's maybe less in between stuff. Good game if you want boss battles. Still sad that the developmental team decided to not make a DLC. I wonder why not. I wonder why not.